The story begins with a millionaire CEO who has everything: wealth, power, and success. Despite his achievements, he remains emotionally distant and disconnected from the world around him. His life, built on ambition, has left little room for personal connections. His father, a traditional man who values family and legacy, arranges a marriage for him to a woman from a poor background. The CEO, resistant to the idea of an arranged marriage, agrees out of duty. Though his heart is not in it, the woman, his wife-to-be, is kind-hearted and humble. She comes from a modest family and is thrust into this marriage against her will. Despite her fears, she accepts the situation with grace, hoping to make the best of it. However, her arrival into the CEO's life is far from welcoming. The CEO's mother, cold and controlling, openly disapproves of her, treating her as beneath them. The wife faces constant prejudice, yet she endures it quietly, holding on to the hope of acceptance and love. The CEO's emotional detachment only deepens the rift, leaving the wife feeling isolated and unloved. Despite their differences, the possibility of change looms on the horizon as the story unfolds. The day of the wedding arrived, and despite the grandeur of the ceremony, the millionaire CEO felt a sense of suffocation closing in on him. His father, an influential figure who had built his empire on rigid tradition, had made the decision for him. The woman he was marrying was from a poor family, a complete stranger to him, and yet it was expected of him to accept this as his fate. The CEO had tried to voice his objections, but his father was resolute. "This is for the good of the family, for our legacy," his father had said, his voice firm and unyielding. "You will understand, son, when you have the responsibility I do. This is how it's done." It was an offer he couldn't refuse, a duty he couldn't ignore. His mother, too, was steadfast in her support of the arrangement. She believed it would strengthen the family's standing, so her approval was as cold and absolute as his father's. On their wedding night, as the CEO sat at the edge of the bed, he couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped. His bride, the woman who was now his wife, sat across from him, dressed in an elegant gown that he didn't choose, her eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and uncertainty. She was a beautiful woman, no doubt, but in that moment, she felt like a stranger to him. His heart was distant, filled with anger and resentment. He had been forced into this, and there was nothing that could change that. He looked at her, his gaze sharp, almost as if he were studying a puzzle he couldn't quite figure out. "I didn't want this," he finally said, his voice low and cold, breaking the silence. "You're not the woman I would have chosen. You're not the life I imagined for myself." Her face tightened at his words, but she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stood up and walked toward him, as though trying to bridge the distance he had already placed between them. "I didn't choose this either," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "But I will try, for you, for us, if you'll let me." His eyes narrowed as he looked away, not wanting to see the pain in her eyes. "I didn't ask for your effort," he said, his words cutting through the air. "Just leave me alone. We don't need to pretend." The wife stood frozen in place, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. She had known from the start that this wouldn't be easy, but she had hoped, at the very least, that they could find some common ground. Yet here he was, pushing her further away. His rejection felt like a deep wound she hadn't expected, and it stung, deep down in her chest. But she swallowed the hurt, determined not to let it show. She had been raised to endure, to fight for what she believed in. And she believed in this marriage. She believed in the possibility of love, even if it seemed impossible at that moment. The next few days were no better. The CEO remained emotionally distant, preferring to lock himself away in his office or retreat to his private study, leaving his wife alone in the massive mansion that now seemed like a prison to her. She tried to make small talk, to share a meal with him, to show him that she cared, but every attempt felt like it hit a brick wall. He would barely glance at her, too consumed by his work or his thoughts to acknowledge her presence. The silence between them grew, suffocating in its intensity. As the days passed, the CEO's coldness only deepened, and the wife began to feel more and more like an outsider in her own home. The staff, too, treated her as though she didn't belong. Whispers followed her from room to room, their eyes filled with judgment. They spoke of her lowly background, of how she wasn't worthy of such a life. And she, in turn, tried to remain invisible, doing what was expected of her without drawing attention to herself. She had been taught to be patient, to keep her head down and work through the discomfort. But there were times when it felt unbearable. She would often retreat to the garden, staring at the flowers as if they held the answers to the turmoil in her heart. The CEO's mother, however, made no attempt to hide her disdain. She was a woman of strong opinions, and she didn't believe in sugarcoating her words. "I don't know what your father was thinking, arranging a marriage like this," she said one day over lunch, her voice dripping with contempt as she glanced toward the wife. "You come from nothing but a poor family, and you think you can come into our world, our legacy, and fit in? It's laughable." The wife could feel her cheeks flush with embarrassment, but she didn't say anything. She had learned long ago not to react, not to give in to the sting of such cruel words. But inside, her heart broke a little more each time. The coldness from the CEO's mother was suffocating, and it made the mansion feel even colder. She felt the walls closing in around her, and she often found herself retreating to the solitude of her room, where she could cry in silence, hoping that someday, somehow, things would change. But nothing did. The CEO remained silent, and his mother's hostility grew. Days blurred into weeks, and the tension in the house only escalated. The wife became more withdrawn, trying to find solace in the small, fleeting moments when the CEO would show the slightest hint of warmth. But they were rare. And when they did happen, they felt like false hope, like something that could never truly exist. Every time he spoke to her, it was a reminder of how little he cared, how little he wanted her in his life. Then, one evening, as they sat in the living room, the CEO spoke, though his words were laced with bitterness. "I didn't ask for any of this," he said, his voice barely audible. "I didn't ask for this marriage, this life. You don't belong here. You never will." His words hit her like a punch to the gut, knocking the breath out of her. She had expected him to be cold, but not this cruel. She had hoped that, in time, things would improve, that they could learn to understand each other. But now, sitting across from him, she saw no future for them. She felt her hope slip away like sand through her fingers. But she didn't cry. She couldn't. Instead, she looked at him, her voice steady but filled with quiet resolve. "Maybe I don't belong here, but I am here, and I will do my best. Not for you, but for myself. Because this is my life now, and I will make something of it." The CEO's eyes flickered with something. Was it regret? Perhaps even a hint of guilt? But he said nothing, merely turning his gaze away from her, as if he hadn't heard her words at all. The silence between them was thick, like a heavy fog that had settled in the room, making it hard to breathe. That night, she lay awake in their large, impersonal bed, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her. She was so far from home, so far from everything she had known. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on her chest, suffocating her in a way she hadn't anticipated. Was it hopeless? Was there any way out of this marriage? Or was this her life now, forever trapped in a loveless relationship with a man who didn't want her, in a family that despised her? As the days went on, she struggled to keep her emotions in check. She held on to her dignity, but deep inside she was breaking. The walls of the mansion seemed to close in on her more each day, and the distance between her and the CEO only grew. She tried to remain hopeful, but with each passing day, the reality of her situation seemed more and more impossible to bear. It was a constant battle between holding on to the hope that things would change and the crushing weight of reality that told her this was her life now. The CEO, too, was struggling in his own way. Though he wouldn't admit it, the tension between them, the rift in his own home, was taking a toll on him. He had hoped for an easy solution, for the marriage to simply fade into the background, but it hadn't. He found himself questioning everything, the life he had chosen, the decisions his father had made for him. But his pride, his refusal to show vulnerability, kept him from acknowledging the growing cracks in his perfect world. He was trapped in a cycle of self-doubt, unable to break free from the role he had been forced to play. And so they both suffered in silence, two people living in the same house, yet worlds apart, bound by duty and family tradition, but unable to bridge the chasm between them. As the weeks passed, something within the CEO began to shift. Though he couldn't quite place it at first. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a soft whisper beneath the noise of his daily routine. The cold, distant feelings he had once harbored toward his wife seemed to dull, replaced by an unfamiliar curiosity. He had always viewed her with disdain, convinced she was nothing more than a pawn in his father's game. But now, he was noticing things about her that he hadn't before, things that made him pause. It began one rainy evening when the CEO found himself on the edge of a personal crisis. His business was facing an unexpected financial setback, and for the first time in a long while, he felt vulnerable. He was pacing the study, running over numbers in his head, when his wife quietly entered the room. She hadn't said much in weeks, her presence more like that of a shadow in the background. Yet there she was, standing in the doorway with a quiet concern in her eyes. "Is everything all right?" she asked softly, her voice gentle but sincere. He turned sharply, frustrated with himself and with the situation. "I don't need your sympathy," he snapped, but even as the words left his mouth, he felt a pang of regret. It wasn't her fault that his world was unraveling. It wasn't her fault that he had spent so much time pushing her away, even though she had done nothing to deserve it. She didn't flinch at his harsh tone. Instead, she walked into the room and placed a warm cup of tea on his desk. "I'm not here to pity you," she said calmly. "But if you need someone to talk to, I'm here. You've been carrying all this weight by yourself, and maybe it's time to share it." The simplicity of her gesture struck him more deeply than he cared to admit. There she was, offering him warmth and support without judgment, when he had done nothing but distance himself from her. His eyes softened, a crack in the armor of his pride forming for the first time in months. He hesitated, looking at the tea she had made for him. It wasn't much, just a simple act of kindness, but it felt like the most sincere thing anyone had done for him in a long time. He looked up at her, this woman who had been so patient, so uncomplaining, even in the face of his coldness. He realized with a jolt how much she had given without asking for anything in return. "I don't know if I can fix this," he admitted, his voice quieter now, tinged with vulnerability. "The business, everything's falling apart. I thought I could handle it all, but I'm not so sure anymore." She sat down across from him, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "You don't have to do it alone," she said softly. "I know you've always been strong, but even the strongest people need support sometimes." Her words lingered in the air, and he found himself staring at her, feeling a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. For a brief moment, the weight of his pride seemed to lift, and he felt seen. The woman he had dismissed so many times was offering him something he hadn't realized he needed: genuine care, without expectation, without demands. It was a strange feeling, like being held up by someone who had every right to resent him, yet chose to stand by him anyway. The next few days saw more moments like this. She would come to him with a small smile, offering support in ways he hadn't asked for, but which he found himself grateful for nonetheless. Sometimes it was a cup of coffee brought to him in the morning, or a quiet word of encouragement when he was facing an important decision. At first, he resisted the tenderness she showed him, brushing it off as mere politeness or duty. But gradually he began to realize that her actions were far from obligatory. She wasn't just being kind because she had to. She was being kind because that was who she was. And for the first time he found himself genuinely appreciating her strength, her quiet resilience. There was one evening, not long after, when the CEO found himself standing in the study again, looking out over the city. It had been a particularly rough day, and his mind was racing with the weight of all his responsibilities. He had barely had a moment to himself, and when he looked up, he noticed her standing in the doorway, watching him with a soft, knowing expression. "I know you're not the kind of person to ask for help," she said quietly, "but I just want you to know that I'm here if you need me. Not as your wife, but as someone who cares." The simplicity of her words hit him like a tidal wave. He had never allowed himself to admit, even to himself, that he might need help, especially not from her. But at that moment, the facade he had so carefully built began to crumble. He turned toward her, his gaze meeting hers, and for the first time, he saw her not as the woman he had been forced to marry, but as someone who was standing beside him, offering him her hand, her heart, without asking for anything in return. "I don't deserve your kindness," he muttered. the words escaping before he could stop them. She shook her head, a small, reassuring smile playing at the corners of her lips. You don't have to deserve it. You just have to accept it. And it was then that the CEO realized she had been offering him something he had never expected: unconditional love and support. It was a feeling he had long since abandoned, convinced that success and power were the only things worth pursuing. But as he looked into her eyes, he began to understand that there was something far more valuable than wealth and status. There was connection and tenderness and a love that could grow even in the most unexpected of circumstances. As the days passed, his feelings for her deepened. The guilt he felt for his previous treatment of her weighed heavily on his heart. He could no longer deny that she had been a constant source of strength, despite the coldness he had shown her. He began to see her not as the quiet, submissive woman he had once thought her to be, but as a partner in every sense of the word, strong, capable, and unwavering. One evening, as they sat together in the garden, the CEO found himself looking at her with a new sense of admiration. "I've been blind," he admitted softly, his voice full of regret. "I've been so focused on my own world that I never stopped to see you really see you. I was so selfish." She didn't respond immediately, instead gazing at him with an expression of quiet understanding. "You're not perfect," she said finally, her voice gentle, "but neither am I. We've both been lost in our own worlds. But maybe that's not the way forward. Maybe it's time we start walking this path together." The words hung in the air, and for the first time, the CEO felt something inside him stir, something warm, something real. He had been so afraid of vulnerability, so terrified of letting anyone in. But now, in this moment, he was beginning to understand that love wasn't about perfection. It was about accepting each other, flaws and all. And as he looked at her, he knew he had been wrong all along. She was more than he had ever given her credit for. And she had shown him a side of life he had forgotten existed. The walls around his heart, once impenetrable, had begun to crumble. And for the first time in a long while, he was ready to let someone in. The news hit the CEO like a lightning strike, the words spoken to him almost incomprehensible as he tried to process the unimaginable. He had been sitting in his office, reviewing some reports, when his phone rang. It was his father's voice on the other end, tense and filled with an emotion he had never heard from him before. "She's gone, son. Your wife, she's been in a car accident. It was fatal. They couldn't recover her body. I'm so sorry." His heart stopped, the words echoing in his mind as if they didn't belong to his reality. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking. "No, this can't be right. She can't be." But the harsh truth settled in like a stone, sinking deeper into his chest with every passing second. His world shattered in that instant. The woman he had learned to care for, the one he had finally begun to love, was gone. But not just gone, her body was never found. It was as though she had vanished into thin air, leaving nothing behind but the hollow space of her absence. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. The pain of loss was unlike anything he had ever known. A dark cloud that consumed every part of him. He wanted to scream, to rage against the unfairness of it all, but the grief was too overwhelming, too suffocating. He had never believed in destiny or fate, but now, as he stood there in the cold silence of his office, it felt like some cruel joke had been played on him. All those moments he had spent pushing her away, all those times he had taken her love for granted, they were now just painful memories, whispers of what could have been. In the days that followed, the CEO withdrew from everything and everyone. His company, his wealth, his achievements, they all seemed meaningless now. What was the point of all the success if he had no one to share it with? What was the point of power and status if the one person who had shown him true love and kindness was no longer in his life? He couldn't escape the guilt. It ate at him, gnawing at the edges of his sanity. He kept asking himself, over and over, why hadn't he told her he loved her more? Why hadn't he been kinder, more patient? Why had he let his pride keep him from truly showing her the appreciation she deserved? The regrets piled up, each one heavier than the last. Every day felt like an eternity, and every moment without her was like a dagger to his soul. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. His grief didn't lessen, it only deepened. He couldn't stop seeing her face in his mind, couldn't escape the memory of her gentle smile, her soft voice. He would find himself reaching for her, only to realize that she was gone, that he would never hear her laugh or feel her hand in his again. The emptiness became unbearable, a constant ache in his chest that no amount of success or distraction could fill. He isolated himself from his friends, his family, even his work. The once dominant CEO became a shadow of himself, unable to function, unable to care about anything. His employees whispered behind his back, wondering if the loss of his wife had broken him beyond repair. But no one could truly understand the depth of his pain. How could they? No one knew what it was like to lose the one person who had finally made him realize that he was capable of love, of vulnerability. No one knew what it was like to lose her. The years dragged on, and the CEO remained trapped in a prison of his own making. His grief was like a silent companion, always there, never leaving. It was with him when he woke up in the morning and when he closed his eyes at night. The guilt never stopped, never relented. He questioned everything, his choices, his actions, the meaning of his life. He had everything a man could want, but in the end he had lost the one thing that truly mattered. Every success, every achievement, felt hollow without her by his side. He thought back to the moments when he had been so distant, so unwilling to open his heart to her. He remembered the way he had brushed aside her kindness, her love, all because of his own arrogance and pride. And now, it was too late. She was gone, and nothing would bring her back. The CEO wondered if he would ever find peace, if he could ever forgive himself for all the years he had wasted, for all the times he had taken her for granted. The pain was relentless, and the loneliness was suffocating. He had no answers, only the knowledge that he had lost the one person who had ever truly seen him, understood him, and loved him despite his flaws. And now, he would live with that loss for the rest of his life. After months of drowning in grief, the CEO began to slowly emerge from the depths of his sorrow. The weight of the loss had been suffocating, but as time passed, he found a flicker of determination within himself. The pain was still there, ever present, but he decided to channel it into something that once seemed unimportant to him, his business. The CEO threw himself back into his work, focusing on rebuilding his empire. He worked late into the nights, making decisions with the sharpness and focus he had once lacked. The pain from his past served as a constant reminder of the stakes, propelling him forward with newfound urgency. With every milestone he reached, whether big or small, there was a sense of accomplishment, but also a nagging emptiness. He had gained more wealth, expanded his company's reach, and established himself even further as a business magnate. Yet something inside him felt incomplete. It wasn't the success that had once driven him. It was the longing for something deeper, something beyond the confines of power and money. During this time, the CEO began to reflect on his past. The grief had forced him to reconsider his priorities, and he realized that he had been blind to the importance of the simplest moments in life. His mind wandered to the times when he and his wife shared quiet moments, her laughter, the warmth in her eyes when she had supported him during his toughest times. He realized how little he had appreciated those fleeting but precious moments of love and connection. They were more valuable than any deal, more significant than any success. This shift in perspective changed him. The CEO started to spend more time with his family and friends, seeking the companionship and support he had long neglected. He began to cultivate relationships with people who genuinely cared for him, not because of his status, but because of who he was as a person. He started to enjoy the small things, early morning walks, listening to music, watching sunsets. It was in these moments of stillness that he felt a sense of peace, a sense of healing. As he grew personally, his professional life also flourished. His business thrived as he made smarter, more thoughtful decisions. But even with all the success, there was still a gnawing feeling deep within him. He had achieved everything he had once dreamed of, yet something crucial was missing. The CEO realized that while success could bring wealth, it could never fill the void left by the loss of his wife. The life he had built had become a monument to his achievements, but he had no one to share it with. Despite all his accomplishments, he knew that the love and connection he had once taken for granted were the true treasures of life. And though he had succeeded in rebuilding his business, he now faced the greatest challenge of all: finding a way to fill the emptiness in his heart. One day, while shopping at a local store, the CEO encountered a young boy who looked eerily similar to him. The child's eyes, smile, and demeanor made the CEO feel a deep, inexplicable connection. He hesitated but couldn't resist striking up a conversation. The boy, around 6 or 7 years old, was shy but friendly. They exchanged a few simple words, and the CEO felt a strange sense of comfort and nostalgia, as if this encounter had a deeper meaning. Over the following weeks, the CEO kept running into the boy at the same store. Each time, they would talk for a little while, and the CEO found himself drawn to the child more and more. The boy's innocent nature and simple joy started to fill the emptiness the CEO had been feeling since his wife's death. The boy reminded him of the warmth and connection he had once taken for granted. Their bond grew naturally, and the CEO found solace in their encounters. The boy's presence, though brief, brought light into the CEO's life, filling a small part of the void that had haunted him for so long. The CEO began to realize that while he couldn't replace the love he had lost, this child's presence could help heal the wounds that had remained open for years. The invitation to the prestigious sports gala came as a surprise to the CEO. He had never been one for public events, but his assistant had insisted, reminding him of the importance of community involvement. After some deliberation, he agreed. As the chief guest, he would be expected to speak and present awards, but he wasn't looking forward to it. He'd rather be focused on his work, on his business, on the life he had carefully built after his wife's tragic passing. Still, he felt it was the right thing to do, to show up and support the event. When he arrived at the gala, the atmosphere was lively, with athletes competing in various events. The CEO tried to keep his mind off the past as he made his way to the front, where he was to be seated. However, just as he was about to settle in, something caught his eye there. Standing on the field in front of a crowd was the same boy he had been meeting for weeks. The boy was performing in a competition, his movements fluid and confident. His energy radiated, and the CEO couldn't take his eyes off him. It felt as though time had stopped, and the world around him blurred. His heart raced as he looked at the child, wondering if it was just a coincidence, or if this was fate. The boy was doing so well, and for a moment, the CEO allowed himself to feel a sense of pride, almost like the child was his own. But before he could gather his thoughts, tragedy struck. As the boy made a particularly daring move, he slipped and fell hard on the ground. A collective gasp rang out through the crowd, and the CEO's heart jumped into his throat. Without thinking, he rushed to the field, his legs moving faster than his mind could process. He knelt by the boy's side, panic rising as he saw the child grimacing in pain. Hey, are you okay?" the CEO asked, his voice shaking with fear. The boy winced, unable to speak through the pain. "Please, don't hurt, the CEO whispered, his hands trembling as he carefully checked the boy's injuries. "I am fine," the boy stammered, his voice small and shaky, but the CEO could see the pain in his eyes. "Don't worry, I'll get you help," the CEO said, his voice filled with urgency as he scooped the child into his arms. He felt an overwhelming sense of protectiveness for this little boy, a boy he barely knew, yet one who had come to mean so much to him in such a short time. The CEO rushed the boy to the hospital, his heart pounding, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. As they arrived at the emergency room, he insisted the doctors take immediate action. He paced nervously, barely able to sit still. The pain the boy was in was a tangible reminder of how fragile life could be and how quickly it could change. Minutes stretched into hours, and the CEO's anxiety grew. He couldn't sit idly by, feeling helpless as the child fought through his injury. He wanted to be there for him, to protect him just like he had failed to protect the one person who had meant everything to him. Finally, the doors to the emergency room opened, and a woman stepped inside. The CEO looked up, his heart stopping in his chest as he took in her appearance. She was standing there alive, his breath caught in his throat as he stared at her. It was her. It was his wife. The woman he had mourned for years, the woman he had thought was gone forever, was standing right before him. "Emily?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Tears welled up in his eyes as he stepped toward her, his hands shaking. He reached out as if afraid she might disappear. As if his mind couldn't fully comprehend what was happening, her eyes widened, and for a moment they just stood there, frozen. "Zaid?" she asked, her voice trembling with shock. "Is it really you?" The world seemed to stand still as they locked eyes, and in that moment, the CEO felt a whirlwind of emotions. Relief, disbelief, anger, and so much more swirled within him. "But the accident, you died," he choked out, tears finally spilling down his cheeks. His wife's face turned pale as she looked away, guilt written all over her expression. "I didn't die," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I faked it. I had to leave. Your mother, she made me leave. She told me you wouldn't be safe with me around. And when the accident happened, I couldn't risk it. I couldn't stay, Zaid. I'm sorry." The CEO staggered backward, as though struck by a blow. His heart thudded painfully in his chest, his mind struggling to process everything. You faked your death?" he repeated in disbelief. "All this time, all these years, I thought I lost you and you were alive?" Tears streamed down both their faces, and the weight of everything they had been through, separated by lies and deceit, crashed over them. The CEO took a step closer, his voice raw with emotion. Why didn't you come back? Why didn't you let me know you were alive?" She stepped forward, her voice thick with sorrow. "I wanted to, Zaid. Every day I wanted to. But I couldn't risk your safety. I thought you'd be better off without me. And then I had to raise our child without you, without any of you knowing the truth." The CEO's heart shattered as the realization sank in. The child, the boy who had brought so much light into his life, was their son, the son he had never known existed. With trembling hands, he reached out to her, pulling her into an embrace, and for the first time in years, he felt the warmth of her presence again. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, as the tears fell freely. "I should have never doubted you. I should have never let you go." Together, they stood there, holding each other in the quiet hospital room, as the realization settled in. Their lives, shattered by lies and grief, were now slowly coming back together. The pain of the past was still there, but in that moment, there was hope. A hope for healing, a hope for a future they could finally share. As the CEO stood there, his heart racing, his mind was struggling to grasp the truth. His wife, the woman he had mourned for so long, was standing before him, her eyes filled with guilt and pain. He could see that she was trembling, as though every word she was about to say would shatter what was left of their world. "I was pregnant when I was forced to leave," she whispered, her voice faltering. "Your mother, Zaid, she made me leave. She told me you wouldn't be safe with me, that I had to go for your own good. And when it happened, I had no choice but to disappear. I couldn't let you find out the truth. She said if I didn't leave, you'd never be able to live your life. So I did what I had to, but it nearly destroyed me." The CEO's breath caught in his throat as her words hit him like a hammer. You were pregnant?" he asked in disbelief. His voice cracked, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. He reached out to her, but his hands were trembling. Why? Why didn't you tell me? Why did you disappear?" She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't have a choice, Zaid. I thought if I stayed, you'd be put in danger. Your mother, she manipulated everything. She told me you'd be better off without me, that I wasn't good enough for you, for your family." The CEO staggered backward, his heart sinking as everything he had once believed collapsed around him. His mind reeled with the realization that his mother, who had always been so controlling, so cruel, had been the one to orchestrate the lie. "My mother, she lied to me?" His voice was barely a whisper. He couldn't fathom how he had been so blind, so trusting of a woman who had caused all of this. Tears streamed down his face as he turned to face her, his heart full of sorrow. "I'm sorry," he choked out, his voice breaking. "I should have never doubted you. I should have never believed her lies. I ruined everything, didn't I? I should have fought for you. I should have trusted you. All those years I let you go, and I let my mother control everything. I'm so sorry." His wife stepped forward, her own tears falling freely. She placed a hand on his chest, as if trying to calm him. "Zaid, it's not your fault. You were deceived. You had no idea what was happening. I don't blame you for any of this. But I missed you. Every day, I missed you. I wanted to come back, but I couldn't risk it. I couldn't risk hurting you more. The CEO's heart shattered as he took a step closer to her, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry. I was a fool. I didn't see the truth. I failed you, and I failed our child, our son," he whispered, his hands gently cupping her face. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know. I love you. I always have." She nodded, her voice trembling as she whispered, "I never stopped loving you either." In that moment, the pain of the years apart, the heartache and the lies, seemed to melt away. The CEO pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, vowing never to let her go again. He had lost so much, but in this moment, he was willing to fight for everything he had once lost, for the family that had been torn apart by deceit. "I will make it right. I will spend every day making it right," he whispered, his heart finally at peace, knowing that their journey together was just beginning again. The CEO and his wife, now reunited, decided to leave the pain of the past behind them. They chose to start fresh, with their hearts open to the love and healing that had eluded them for so long. The CEO purchased a beautiful home, a symbol of their new beginning, a place where they could build a life full of joy and togetherness. As they moved into their new home, the child became the glue that held their family together. The CEO, now more present than ever, cherished every moment with his wife and son, determined to make up for the years lost to lies and misunderstandings. His heart swelled with gratitude for the second chance he had been given. In the warmth of their home, surrounded by love, they rebuilt what had been broken. The CEO had learned to value the things that truly mattered: family, love, and the happiness that comes from being together. Their life was no longer defined by the pain of the past, but by the hope and promise of the future. Together, they found peace, love, and happiness, creating a life where their love would continue to grow, ever stronger, ever brighter.